As an RPG enthusiast, trying to get the most out of each role-playing session, taking that rule set, whatever it's going to be, Dungeons & Dragons, Dark Heresy, Alien the RPG, Paranoia, Rollmaster, GURPS, and trying to do something different with it. This is why one of the things that I've recommended as a GM is as you're playing games and running games, naturally based on your GM personality and the type of adventures and scripts and quests that you like to run, along with kind of the player personality, we tend to run a certain set of adventures. But every now and then, be open to trying something different, pushing something different, experimenting with something. And that might be one game or a short 1, 2, or 3 game adventure, doing something different. Within that framework, I wanted to share a Warhammer 40,000 and Dungeons & Dragons crossover. Now, I'm fortunate to be able to game and roll dice with a bunch of excellent friends. We've got a great community, and there's kind of 3 communities interlaced in there. We've got board games, we've got war games, and that flavor, that thread is kind of an interesting mix of historicals and Warhammer 40,000. And then we've got some role players, mostly D&D. There is a good crossover for the players that are interested in board games. They're also interested in war games, and they're also interested in role-playing games. While I tend to run Dungeons & Dragons the most, from time to time, I also run Dark Heresy. Now, Dark Heresy is a Warhammer 40,000 system. It's kind of based on the old Warhammer fantasy roleplay system. It's kind of upgraded for the Grimdark. And what's very interesting about it is I can easily pull in players because we've got D&D players and also 40K players. So the D&D players kind of understand that role playing, and the 40K players, they easily jump in and understand that lore. So we're playing that on and off. A couple of times a year, I'll run a small campaign. We wanted to do a crossover. They're like, Fritz, let's pull in some interesting aspects. And those interesting aspects are when you have someone that's played Dungeons and Dragons, or really any kind of role-playing system, and that is their primary role-playing system. When they jump into a new role-playing system, they can pick up the rules pretty quick, but that narrative, that lore, that kind of community culture of that role-playing system, that takes a little while to figure out. So when you make that jump, really knowing nothing about Warhammer 40,000, you're playing D&D, you're like, hey, my man Fritz is running a Dark Heresy campaign. He needs some players. I'll jump in. It's kind of like a system shock. And likewise, there are a few 40K players that got involved in Dark Heresy because they've got the miniatures, they've got the lore, they're doing this 40K thing. And then when they jump into D&D, it's kind of an interesting shock from that perspective. So I had 2 groups of players that were interested in exploring both those aspects, and they wanted to do a crossover. My Dark Heresy players, some of them have familiarity with D&D, some of them don't, and my D&D players have no idea of what Dark Heresy is, but both agreed, Fritz, run an adventure, figure it out, where it's Dungeons and Dragons, some sort of magic, something happens, and these Dark Heresy Inquisitors, players, come over to the D&D universe. And let's run an adventure where we've got the D&D party playing their D&D characters, and we've got the Dark Heresy characters playing their Dark Heresy characters. Together, what would that look like? Make it happen. So I sit down and say, well, look, let's do it, right? Let's take both these systems and see what we can do. But we've got 2 separate mechanics that I kind of need to adapt and that I want to preserve. Now, in Dark Heresy, that Warhammer 40,000 narrative, just for a framework, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, there's 2 interesting things I had to figure out. First, how do I transfer weapons? Now, you've got swords, and you've got axes, and you've got knives. You've got power weapons. Think of an energy sword. You've got various close combat weapons. You also have firearms, projectile weapons, ranging from lasers to kind of slug throwers and plasma guns and everything in between. So I needed to take those weapons and translate them over to D&D but also preserve the character and the lethality of it. So we kind of had to have that happen. And at the same time, magic in Dark Heresy. It's not necessarily magic. It's more like psychic powers, but it taps into this realm called the warp. And if we're going to call it magic, it is extremely dangerous. Playing a psyker, a magic user, a mage, a wizard in Dark Heresy, you've got the power, but you got to be careful using it because it can really mess with time and space. It can mess with you, unintended consequences. Think of like the ultimate D&D wild mage jacked up. I wanted to preserve that. So I'm not going to have a Dark Heresy character just casting magic missile that doesn't exist. They're going to be using their magic. And likewise, the D&D players, well, they're going to be interacting and using their stuff. And if they boost that or if they work with the Dark Heresy characters, then I want to preserve that of D&D. So I decided not to do a one-to-one conversion. We see this with some of the older D&D modules, where if it's written for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons or D&D 3.x, it gets updated for the current. I wanted to preserve both. So what that meant was figuring out in that moment and doing that conversion on the fly. And it's not going to be perfect, but it just has to work and be good enough. So an example was, if you have a Dark Heresy character, Imperial Guard, think of a soldier, right? Kind of drafted by the Inquisition to go out and deal with heretics and troubleshoot and solve all interesting problems. They've got a slug thrower. Think of just a rifle. When they shoot at a target, I've got to convert that into a D20, right? If we're shooting at the D&D target, I got to convert that into a D20. I have them roll a D20. I take into account modifiers. I take into account armor class. Essentially, it's a DC check. And if they hit, then at that point, I convert the damage from Dark Heresy into D&D, rolling on the Dark Heresy damage charts and figuring out how much damage would that really cause. Now, that's a lot more damage than D&D weapons would ever happen if it's futuristic advanced weapons. Likewise, when the D&D stuff, the Dark Heresy characters came over. There's like this portal event, they come over. But other aspects came over also. They were hunting down, the Dark Heresy players were hunting down some cultists, some chaos cultists. There was a chaos sorcerer, and they came over also unknown. So now you had the D&D people, the D&D party working with the Dark Heresy party, fighting at some point in the adventure these cultists and a Dark Heresy sorcerer. So then I had to convert D&D stuff to hit into Dark Heresy, and then on the Dark Heresy charts, have that convert to damage, all in that moment. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly was very, very interesting running both mechanics, running both physics, whatever we want to call it, and making those conversions back and forth. This idea of taking your role-playing system, and this is an example of a crossover, but it could easily be an excellent adventure that you've played in one system, and you're like, look, this is a great adventure that the community wrote. This is a great adventure that this person created. I want to play that in my whatever game. So being aware that it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough for everyone to have a good time and to create some unexpected results. But being open as an RPG enthusiast to different ways you can explore your system and different ways that you can play the game.